All right, let's get a little world history in. Now, today will be a lot shorter than yesterday. Let me hand this down just a little bit. And I hope y'all are doing well. We're going to boogie through this fairly rapidly. Imperialism, we talked a little bit about that yesterday. Imperialism is the idea that, one nation could control less powerful nations. And there were some nations that were bigger imperialists than others. France, Britain were big imperialists. They um, believed in this, they saw an opportunity. America really never has been an imperialist country. Now, some would argue that. Some would say, well, you took this island and that island. I'll remind you of the time that during a war we marched down to Mexico City and we took Mexico City over. And we made the Mexican army surrender as a result. But guess what? We gave them back Mexico City. If we were a true imperialist nation, guess what? We would own Mexico today. We didn't seek to take others over, per se. Stuff happened. Stuff was given to us in concessions during war. But that's how we picked up an Asian island or two, and how we picked up Puerto Rico and things of that nature. But we haven't just sought to take advantage of weaker nations. So, I would argue that America is not imperialist, but Great Britain was. They would, see something, they would take it over. We're going to talk about Africa on Monday. Africa was a nation, and we'll get into this, but my goodness, every nation that could get a chunk of Africa took it. And you can imagine in a lot of these instances, India was the same way. You've got high-powered rifles coming at people with bows and arrows and spears. Who's going to win? You bring in a machine gun later on in Africa. Yeah, who's going to win? The people with the higher firepower. But your book gives the definition of imperialism. This starts on page 430, so if you will turn there, I'm going to get a drink of water and we'll go through it fairly quickly. It says the dominance and power asserted by one nation over a less powerful nation or less powerful nations. So that's the textbook definition of imperialism. But your book gives 4 reasons for imperialism. I would argue a couple of those, but let's go through them nonetheless. The major reason, you've got this industrial revolution. We've talked about that. We're starting to make a lot of stuff. Great Britain making a lot of stuff. France making a lot of stuff. The Dutch countries making a lot of stuff. What does it take to make a lot of stuff? Raw materials. Okay, if you're going to make tires, you need something to make tires with. Where you're going to get rubber in Great Britain, well, it's going to be hard pressed to do. But Africa has a bunch of it. You need some metal. Well, where are we going to get it? Well, don't know, but here's some here. You need all of these things, raw materials, wood, on and on, raw materials to make things. So if you could find another country that you could latch on to, you could put under your control, then you have access to their raw materials. Also, another reason given, intense nationalism. Hey, it made these countries proud. We aren't just a landlocked nation of, let's say, Great Britain. We don't have just these British Isles here and that's it. Oh no, we're Great Britain. We have Australia, and we have Canada, and we have and on and on. We have all of these colonies in Africa, and we have India, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. It gives you this sense of national pride. We're great. We're a world power. That is one of the reasons. Another reason that your book does not mention, and let me just mention this about imperialism, it opens up trade. Okay? And I'll give you an example. And I like to talk about the African colonization more, as you can tell, because I keep referring to Africa. But if I start a colony in Africa, and people in Africa have never had, widget, this particular widget. They've never seen it before. You show them this widget and they're like, wow, this is cool. Okay? I want a widget. And their neighbors are like, I want a widget, and I want a widget, and on and on. And you have this demand for widgets. Where are they going to buy their widgets from? The mother country. So Great Britain makes up some more widgets. They send them down on the next ship to their colony in Africa. And guess what? Their trade has increased. And your book does not mention that, but that is one of the reasons for imperialism. It gave you a place to purchase products. Same thing with the original 13 colonies in the United States. Where did we buy most of our products from? And some were mandated we had to buy them from Great Britain. It opened up a trade source. So as colonies grow, your trade increases and your economy booms as a country. A couple of reasons that your book also mentions for imperialism: humanitarianism. Okay, you look at some of these countries, some of these smaller countries, underserved, struggling, poor, third world economies, those type of things. Would they not be better off? And this is one of the arguments, and I can argue it both ways. Jane, where are you? I can argue it both ways. I could go either way. If I live in a small colony somewhere, or a small country somewhere, and I don't have a hospital, and I don't have good roads, and I don't have schools, and I have pathetic housing, and I don't have extra clothes, and I don't have good food sources, and this big country comes in, and all of a sudden, they're building hospitals, they're building roads, they're building schools, they're doing all of these things, they're bringing in crops, and we have food to eat. Am I not better off? Well, I would argue on one side, yes, I am. Now I have health care, now I have education. But by the same token, I could also argue, well, if I'd have wanted that, maybe I'd have built it myself. Maybe that's the way I like living, simple, free. So you could argue either side of that, but that's one of the reasons that these countries said, well, we're humanitarians. We are going in, we're helping these people, we're improving their conditions, we're getting rid of the mosquitoes, we're getting rid of the diseases, we're getting rid of all of this stuff, and we're making things better for them. Where their people are saying, hey, you come in here at gunpoint, and you build all of these things and force us to like it. One of those arguments. The other thing that your book mentions, and your book says it wasn't a dominant thing. I don't think it was a major player in it. I don't think nations, I don't think the Queen sat down and said, hey, the one thing I want to make sure we do is spread Christianity to these countries. But it did open the door for missionaries to go in and share the gospel in these countries that we had never had access to before. These countries had never had access to before. The gospel had never gone in. So that is one of the factors, but I wouldn't put it up there as a major player in the scheme of things. Your book talks about Asia and India, imperialism in the East, and we're going to start with India. There was the 7 Years' War. This was a big war, by the way, the 7 Years' War. It was on several continents, but the 7 Years' War between Britain and France, they were always fighting. But during the 7 Years' War, an Indian ruler sided with the French, and he attacked a British settlement. And it created the Battle of Plassey, and British forces were led by Robert Clive. They defeated the Indian forces. Later on, Clive would defeat the French, and they set up for the next 100 years, the British East India Company. Now, the British East India Company had been around for a while, but they put them basically in charge of India's government. So it was trade combined with government, the British East India Company. Now, we let them rule as an Indian federation. So, in other words, Queen Victoria, not Queen Elizabeth II. If you Googled certain answers, by the way, the longest monarch now is Queen Elizabeth II, but in the period we were talking about, Queen Victoria. Neither here nor there. But Queen Victoria was not made the Queen of India like she was other countries. She was made the Empress of India. So they let the Indian people kind of have a say in their rule, but at the same time they were British owned, British operated. Now, the East India Company, British East India Company, did not want missionaries coming in because they thought, hey, if we upset the apple cart here, if these people start becoming Christians, then the Muslims are going to be mad, the Hindus are going to be mad, and it's going to hinder our trade. They tried to keep a guy by the name of William Carey out of the country. If you'll read about him on 432, very interesting. And he did a great work in India. William Carey, one of the fascinating missionaries of all time. And we'll talk about another one here in just a minute who was even more fascinating, I think, than William Carey. Both of them great guys. And then your book mentions the Sepoy Mutiny. Pretty interesting stuff. The Brits and the British East India Company had hired Indian soldiers to fight for them. And they had these new guns, and they had shells that you had to take the cartridge, put it in your mouth, and rip it off, rip the paper off. Well, it was greased in sheep fat. So, you would get sheep fat in your mouth. Be careful. And the rumor got out there that it was either pig fat or cow fat. Well, either way you lose, because the reason there's so many cattle running around India is because the Hindus believe that there's reincarnation and that cow could be somebody's uncle. So they didn't want to put Uncle Bob in their mouth and rip them off. Also, if you were Muslim and it happened to be pig fat, guess what? You're defiled. So they had a mutiny, and the long and short of it, the mutiny was put down and suppressed by the British government. And you can imagine, if you have to put down a mutiny of such, you're going to have a tighter reign on people, and Britain certainly did that. Talks about China a little bit. Just a couple of things that are important. It talks about the Manchu dynasty, and they would close all of the ports to other people. But there was a war between China and Great Britain, and China had done little to stop British traders from smuggling opium. Now, opium made from poppy, the poppy flower, or the poppy, and it was a very, as your book says, dangerous drug, hallucinogen. And so the Chinese people fell in love with opium. They were becoming addicted. And the Chinese finally tried to get them to stop bringing the opium in. They said, hey, we need to stop this. Well, the British protested, and they ended up forcing China to sign a treaty in 1842 that opened even 4 more ports and gave Britain the island of Hong Kong, all because of the Opium Wars. And it amazes me, baffles me, that a country that knows that people are becoming addicted to a drug that was dangerous are like, hey, we need to open more trade for this drug. I mean, this was a country doing it. So, it baffles, blows my mind, but Britain was sanctioning drug use and drug selling, kind of like Colorado with their marijuana. I mean, stupidity. But anyway, your book talks about Hudson Taylor. Read about him, please, on page 433. Very interesting, great missionary, and a lot of famous quotes by Hudson Taylor. He was a strong man of faith. Also, Westerners believed in extraterritoriality. And basically what that meant, that if I'm in China, I break their law, I'm not tried in China. I'm sent back to my home territory. Chinese did not like this, China. And also the Chinese got angry at several other things that were going on with this British influence and this Western influence. And so they would form societies, little groups here and there. One of the most famous ones were the Righteous and Harmonious Fists. The Righteous and Harmonious Fists. And they ended up rebelling. They would go around and murder folks. They would murder missionaries. They would murder the missionary families. They would murder merchants. They would murder government officials. And it was called the Boxer Rebellion because of the righteous and harmonious fists. So anyway, Europe and Japan and United States went over there. It got so serious, and they put this rebellion down big league and stopped it quickly. You'll read about Matthew Perry on page 434. I'm going a little longer than I thought I would. 434, Matthew Perry, basically to persuade the Chinese to, or Japanese, excuse me, now we're moving on to Japan, to persuade them to trade with the United States. He took some warships over there and put them in the harbor and said, hey, you need to trade with us. We'd really love to trade with you. By the way, do you like our warships? So they ended up signing the Treaty of Kanagawa, which was the first trade agreement that Japan had ever signed with a Western nation, which was very important. Now, something's going to happen in Japan, and it's the Meiji period. And during the Meiji period, they looked for Western influence. They would send people to Western nations. They would watch how Western nations dressed and how they talked and how they thought and how they lived life. And they brought these Western ways back to Japan, and it is going to totally change the nation. You'll also read some other stuff about China and Japan fighting each other. Remember, Japan never lost a war until World War II. Finally, just a couple of things. Page 436, and we're finished. The Dutch East Indies, the major Dutch possession in Southeast Asia was the Dutch East Indies, which is now modern Indonesia. The big thing about that is they used the culture system. And basically 1/5 of the natives' land was theirs, and 1/5 of their time to grow crops for the Dutch. And so you go in and say, hey, give us 1/5 of the land and 1/5 of your time and grow us some crops. So imperialism is kind of one of those dark things. And some people think imperialism was great, and I go back to the argument, well, maybe we did better some countries. You look at the way these countries are today, how would they have fared if, we hadn't have gone in? Would they still be, living in huts and those type of things as opposed to the way they are now? And we'll talk about Africa tomorrow and a lot of that changed there. And you can look at it from that standpoint. Same point you can look at the way the Native Americans lived here in this land before Europeans came. They lived in smaller houses and all of that stuff. Did we help them out, give them health care? It's one of those arguments that you can argue for or against, but imperialism is what it is. Some people equate it to the slave trade. Some people equate it to the way we treated Native Americans, but the fact is it happened, and it is what it is. So if you will, make sure you've read through that. No assignment for today, but on Monday we are going to boogie through and hopefully hit the, no we will, we'll finish the chapter, probably have a test on Tuesday, and we're going to move into the modern world. So if we make it to that point, we're doing great. Listen, have a great weekend. Make sure you read over that, though, because we will have a test on it, and you'll want to know where this stuff is, not just Google it, Queen Elizabeth II. And listen, have a great weekend. Miss y'all. Bye.